The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus Van Staden, a senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, in our last show, we talked about the confusion that a lot of people have about the Belt and Road. And I published a post on LinkedIn and on Medium where I said, if you're confused about what Belt and Road is, well, you're not alone. And we ended our show last week with Eric Meister-Lino, where you and I kind of said, can't figure out what this thing is. And what was interesting was that I got a lot of feedback from Chinese listeners and Chinese readers on LinkedIn who said, what are you talking about? The Belt and Road is pretty straightforward. It's a vision. It's not a policy. It's not an agenda. And I kind of walked away from these discussions thinking, wow, we look at this from two totally different points of view. Chinese people for the past 6-7 years have been hit by a barrage of messaging, of propaganda, of news coverage. And so Belt and Road for them means something very, very different than what it means for the West and in the United States and Europe in particular, but Africa as well. Whereas we've talked about on a number of previous shows, the Chinese have been god-awful terrible in communicating not just about Belt and Road, but in general. So it's not surprising that people in places like Africa are confused about what exactly is Belt and Road. Is it a development program? Is it a geostrategic, agenda that the Chinese have? Is it about military, like in Djibouti? Is it about, sending raw materials to China and then finished goods back to those parts of the world? So that to me was so interesting that our show last week revealed these huge discrepancies between how people perceive Belt and Road. One final comment before I kind of turn it over to you. Somebody pointed out to me, they said the Belt and Road is like the Bush administration's global war on terror. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. But what it was so ambiguous that it allowed a lot of different people to attach their own agendas to this vague vision. So I thought those were very interesting responses to our discussion last week.
Yes, it provides quite an interesting kind of different spin on it. I guess it opens the possibility to have a conversation about how the Belt and Road isn't really a plan, but more of a kind of a channeling of energy. Kind of that there's a decision that, okay, energy and capital and human effort all of those are going to be channeled in this particular direction. And then what the particular projects that happen within that, those projects aren't necessarily centrally decided, but the kind of general direction of where those projects are going to happen, that is a central decision. I mean, that's kind of where I'm at the moment, but I'm sure I'm wrong on a number of different levels.
Well, I got to be honest with you, Cobus, you don't sound entirely confident in your description of what Belt and Road is. I mean, it was, you're stretching right there. But we thought it would be interesting today to get a Chinese perspective on this, because we've heard a lot from the West on Belt and Road. We've heard a lot from Africa on the Belt and Road. But what we haven't heard is the Chinese side. Now, there is no single Chinese voice on this other than maybe Xi Jinping himself. I'm not so sure he's going to come on our show, but nonetheless, we should put an offer out anyway. So we thought we went out into our network and we said, who can we find that can talk to us about what Belt and Road is? And I think this would be so important for our listeners in Africa and those studying Africa to really gain some understanding of this. Now, remember, Belt and Road is not an African initiative. Africa, in just a few countries and just a small part of the continent, is connected with it. So it's important that we maybe broaden our focus today beyond the African continent to look at what's happening in other parts of the world, namely the Americas, South America, Central America, as well as Eastern Europe, and now Italy for the first time. So we are so happy that Zhu Zheng, who is an independent analyst who focuses on risk analysis, emerging markets, and Chinese outbound investment, is here to join us. And he joins us on the line from Warsaw, Poland. And so a very, very good afternoon to you, Jung. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you for having me here, Eric.
Well, before we get started, let me just introduce a little bit more about your background so that people can have a better understanding of your expertise in Belt and Road. You provide in-depth analysis for Chinese investors on about international stock markets, real estate, and political economy for countries along the Belt and Road. You're also a columnist on international affairs for the Chinese financial newspaper Caixin and a research fellow at the China CEE Institute. Now, for those of you not familiar with China CEE Institute, it's very, very interesting. The CEE stands for China, Eastern Europe, and it's China's first think tank that's independently registered in Europe. Zheng has been to more than 40 countries, and he's now doing a 6-month field study on Chinese investments in Europe, where he's traveling from Serbia to Belarus and now in Poland. And that's why we are so happy to be able to talk to you today, Zheng. I think we're going to put out another disclaimer very quickly here before we get into our discussion. Zheng is not an African specialist, so that's not why we have Zheng on the show today, but rather he's an expert in Chinese emerging market analysis. And more importantly for us, he speaks directly with Chinese investors and clearly through the media to a Chinese audience. And one of the things that we want to try and get out of our discussion today is what are the themes and the topics that Chinese people are having about the Belt and Road that may shed some insight into what we are not understanding from reading the international press, the African press, and particularly in the United States and Europe as well. So with that in mind, Zheng, thank you again for joining us.
No problem.
Okay. I'm going to give you a really simple question, but I think you're going to have a hard time with it, okay?
Mm-hmm.
You are a guy who has spent a lot of time traveling to countries in Latin America. You're in Europe right now. You are on the proverbial Belt and Road. So you should know better than anybody. What exactly is the One Belt, One Road?
Well, I will say One Belt, One Road is a vision, Chinese vision to connect the world. I think the key element of One Belt, One Road is that it's commercial. It's a big business idea to do win-win business with other countries. So most people, especially from the West, they are very concerned about China's so-called strategic or political ambition to dominate the world by this One Belt, One Road initiative. From my point of view, I think it's overthinking. From the Chinese side, we just want to do business with other countries. So I think One Belt, One Road, just a business plan, a huge business plan to do business with other countries.
To which extent does the Belt and Road still have a geographical component? So obviously, like around from 2013 to roughly 2015 or so, there was a map that was circulating, with these two routes, one over land and one over sea, both essentially connecting China with Western Europe. To which extent is the connection between China and Western Europe still a big kind of preoccupation for the Belt and Road, and to which extent has it essentially moved beyond geography as completely?
Well, I think that's a interesting question. So recently, there's two schools of geography. One is called geoeconomic, which is how economic and geography play with each other, interact with each other. One is called geopolitics, which is how politics and geography interact with each other. I would say One Belt, One Road is mainly about geoeconomic. You see China try to build a railway and a highway from China to Europe. But our end goal is to send Chinese products or foreign products to China to do win-win business deals between those countries along One Belt, One Road. So the main purpose for this huge infrastructure plan is to connect the world. So trade and investment can happen. It's not like sending Chinese troops to Eastern Europe. It's just not the case.
Now, you do not work for the government, so you do not speak on behalf of the government, and I'm not going to ask you to speak on behalf of the government. But I am curious because you have brought up a lot of the same talking points that the government has. Win-win development, it's just business. But what makes China so interesting is that the line between business and politics is not the same as it is in, say, the United States or Japan, where they don't, the United States does not have state-owned enterprises that get credit from the China or the Exim Bank in the same way that the Chinese do, and doesn't have the resources, and it doesn't have the alignment of the political objectives and the commercial objectives the same way that the Chinese do. I don't actually attach any value to that. There's two different systems. They're behaving in two very different ways. But I'm wondering if you can see why people in other parts of the world are concerned and struggle to understand the idea that it is just business when you have, in fact, a very prominent role of the state that's actually behaving in this way. So that's where, again, where we're struggling to understand what is Belt and Road. If it's just business, then you would have private companies doing it, not state-owned enterprise doing it. And because the state is involved, it makes people think that it's more than just geoeconomics, but it's actually geopolitics. And what do you think when you're in places like Europe and you're talking to people like that and they have these kind of questions? How do you respond to that? How do you answer those?
Well, I will say first, if the state is involved, it does not necessarily mean the state have a plan to do some military or like geoeconomic stuff. The state just maybe just simply want to do improve its economy and help its company to do business in foreign countries. So that's the first point. When the state is involved, it does not mean the state is interested in other political activity. That's the first point. The second point, why Chinese state is so involved in this One Belt, One Road initiative. That's because Chinese economic structure is very how to say state focused. We have lots of SOEs, and if we look at the infrastructure sector, most of those companies doing business abroad, they are state-owned. Also, the energy sector. So if we're talking about infrastructure and energy and mining as well, we cannot avoid those state-owned companies because it's just the domestic economic structure of China. So when China doing business with other countries, so it may export its domestic economic structure to abroad. That's why you can see lots of Chinese company, especially state-owned companies, they are doing business in countries.
But do you understand why people are concerned, though? Is that do Chinese people and yourself and Chinese stakeholders, because it doesn't seem like they understand why people around the world, not just in Europe or the United States, but in lots of countries, are concerned about what you've just said, that the fact that they are state companies and that there may be something, but they don't really know. Do you understand? Is that something that people think about, or Chinese people and Chinese in the discussions that you have on Beijing and with your clients and others, they don't talk about that?
Well, I think this concern is legit. But I think foreigners need to really understand when those SOEs go abroad, they they don't have their own their own like political agenda. They just want to do business with foreign countries. So when people see Chinese SOEs coming to places like Africa or Europe, they get scared because they think it's the machine from the huge Chinese state. But it's not the case. When China, for example, when China want to do business in one country, you can see several Chinese state-owned companies, they are competing with each other for the same project. If a Chinese state is a huge united machine, it will not happen. It will not allow several SOEs competing for the same project, which costs China a lot of money because now the price is lower. So people just think, oh, China is a huge uniting machine, but it's not happening. When we do One Belt One, it's still the small companies or SOEs, they are doing the job, and they are not one united unit, which people think.
A lot of the discussion, especially in Africa, around the Belt and Road Initiative focuses on infrastructure, and of course that's one of the reasons. Among other reasons, because Africa is so fixated at the moment on infrastructure in order to develop. But of course, as you've pointed out, a very large part of the BRI has to do with trade. So I recently read an interesting paper that pointed out that now that the overland train connection between China and Europe is actually up and running, and there's many trains kind of traveling between China and Europe all the time. What they frequently find is that the trains that go from China to Europe are all full of products to sell, but there's actually not that much that the European Union can sell back to China. And so frequently the trains that go back to China from Europe are half full or even empty. So how do you foresee the fact that China manufactures so much and almost all of its BRI partners don't manufacture nearly as much? How does that impact that trade imbalance? How does that impact the BRI as a whole?
Actually, it's a very important question from China. That's also one of the reasons I'm now doing the research project in Europe, because what you raised is definitely a concern from the China side. If you look at the cargo train from China to Europe and back, you see actually there's a lot of government subsidy in these railways. And you are right. From Europe to China, lots of cargo trains are empty. But we have to see the development. If we compare it to now with, say, 5 years ago or 3 years ago, it has improved dramatically. Now, 5 years ago, 3 years ago, almost all the cargo train lines, they suffer losses. But now you can see some lines, they are actually profitable, and the goods from Europe to China actually are increasing. But I'm not sure about 5 years ago, or 5 years later, or 3 years later, how it will happen. But if you look at the past 3 years, actually this situation is improving. But to what extent, it's still a question, because the economic structure of China and Eastern Europe or Central Europe, they are actually you cannot magically create or try to organize a cargo line which can change the economic structure of those countries. And trade is really based on economic structure of those countries. So yes, things is improving, but to what extent those all cargo line will be profitable, I'm not sure yet.
Support for this podcast comes from the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University School of Journalism in Johannesburg. The ACRP provides reporting grants, workshops, and other professional development opportunities for both African and Chinese journalists. Follow the ACRP on Twitter at Wits China Africa or visit africachinareporting.co.za for information about grants and upcoming seminars.
Let's turn to the question of debt, because debt is really a very important part of the Belt and Road initiative here. And it's important in a couple different ways. Number one is that China's using debt as a way to facilitate the acquisition of natural resources. So in places like Angola, it is collateralizing Angolan oil in order to purchase oil, and then in exchange, it is building infrastructure. So there's an equitable balance there in some respects that they're giving and getting. But at the same time, in some countries, including in Eastern Europe, there is growing concerns that the amount of debt that the Chinese government is putting onto countries that may or may not be able to repay it is getting too high. And this is really the focus of concern in the West. And the West has some legitimate reason to be worried, because they are concerned that if the Republic of Congo or if Belarus or some other country collapses under the weight of Chinese debt, that it won't be the Chinese that end up paying for it. It'll be the IMF or the World Bank or the Western governments that in the past have come to rescue these countries. That is part of the concern. The other part of the concern is that China will, of course, use the leverage of debt to exact political influence. So I'm curious, when you talk about Belton Road and this question of debt, again, with your stakeholders and in the media and what you're reading, is there a concern in the Chinese media and among Chinese stakeholders about the debt issue in the same way that there is with the West, or is that something totally different?
So if you look at the Chinese official media, they will say it's a bullshit. They think China is actually helping those countries to develop its infrastructure. But from my independent research, and I'm a country risk analysis, which means I analyze the sovereign risk of those countries. I see lots of those projects, they are very risky in terms of financial returns. So from the China side, if I'm the president of China, or like a president of those banks, if someone say, okay, let's give money to, for example, Congo or Montenegro to build this highway, I think from financial project, from financial terms or from the project management terms, I think those projects are very risky. I will not do that. But from those countries' perspective, I think it's actually good. Now I'm in Poland, and last month I was traveling around Balkan countries like Serbia and Montenegro. You know, Montenegro has a huge Chinese infrastructure investment. It's maybe its first highway, and it's count like 10% of, I forgot, 10% or like 20% of its total GDP. Some people think, well, this project is very risky for Montenegro. I'm not sure if they will able to pay back for it. But from Montenegro's perspective, they think this project is very good. It's because its main industry is tourism, and if they have this highway, it can help its increase tourism revenue. But they have tried to borrow money from IM, from EU, and they also all say no. And then now they turn to China, and China say yes. If I'm the Chinese top manager from the China side, I'll probably not do that. Because it's too risky, but I don't know why the China just borrow money to Montenegro. But from Montenegro perspective, I think it's quite good because they only have two options. One is poor forever. One is borrow money from China, build the highway and increase the tourist revenue. There's some possibility, of course, the project will fail or the project cannot achieve the initial goal. But there's hope anyway. If they don't get money from China, they don't see the future of the country. So from Montenegro's perspective, they are quite happy because now they finally see the hope for their country to develop. And funny enough, after China agreed to give money to Montenegro, EU began to stand up, say, "Oh, you should be very concerned about Chinese loan there. It's a debt trap." And then Montenegro says, "Oh, so before we borrow money from China, we turn to you and you decline. And where were you when we tried to borrow the money?" So from their perspective, also from Serbia's perspective, they think EU is very hypocritical. So they think China is a better partner.
So as you mentioned, you work a lot in risk analysis, and with Chinese corporate clients. What are some of their concerns around the Belton Road Initiative and doing business in all of these different countries?
Well, so if you look at Chinese investment in developing countries, like 10 years ago, you see lots of failed cases, especially regarding political risk. So now I think Chinese companies are more and more aware that if the country and China have good relationship, does not mean it can guarantee you success in that country. If, for example, if the regime changed, then it will impact Chinese investment there. So they are become more and more concerned or have higher awareness of political risk in those countries. Second, if I think private companies, they are more flexible regarding investment and the project management. So some Chinese state-owned companies, they are still have their way of doing things, which may not may be good in some area, but not good in other geographical areas. So I think private clients, they are more flexible regarding investment.
Well, I mean, taking that all into account, looking out now 5-10 years, I'd like to close our discussion now on where you see Belton Road going. What do you think, if we were going to do this podcast 10 years from now and we're looking back on 20 years of Belton Road projects, or 17 years, if you will, what are we going to see? What do you think this is? Where's this going?
I think it will go in for long time, for several decades. And I will think now we can see lots of failure, but I think it's just a learning process, just like a Chinese company going abroad, acquiring foreign companies. The first few deals, they are all failed because Chinese companies just don't know how to invest in foreign country, how to merge and acquire foreign companies. And then they learn their license. And now you can see a Chinese company doing quite well in foreign countries. I think same for One Belt, One Road. Lots of infrastructure projects, they will fail. But then which Chinese companies, they acquire knowledge about certain countries and they learn from their failure. So I think 10 years down the road, I think the success of One Belt Round will be better than now.
Zhu Zheng is a columnist on international affairs for the Chinese financial newspaper Beijing. He's also an independent risk analyst in emerging markets and a specialist on the Belton Road. Traveled to more than 40 countries, and he's right now in the middle of a 6-month research project in Eastern Europe, traveling in Poland, in Serbia, in Belarus, looking at the Belton Road there and sharing a lot of the insights on the Chinese point of view on this. And boy, I cannot emphasize how different it is. And Zheng, I just think it's so great that you had the time to join us today. We really appreciate your insights.
No problem. Thank you.
Cobus, I have to tell you that I think a lot of our listeners in Africa, in Europe, in the United States, and even in Asia, are going to feel unsatisfied with a lot of Zheng's answers. But I will also want to tell you that I think Zheng really, really captures what a lot of Chinese people feel. So a couple key things here. Number one, the time horizon. People, they're making mistakes now, but they're going to figure this out down the road. Remember that they're thinking this in generational terms. And I think that, in the US and in Europe, they're thinking this right now, what's going on. Debt, failure of this project, that project. They're not looking at that. They're looking at a much longer time horizon, 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Very, very important to understand. And I think that's consistent in China about how they see a lot of geopolitics, and we don't see it the same way. We're looking at much more the immediate thing. The other interesting thing is what he said right at the beginning was this is just business. This isn't politics. And boy, we don't see that in the West. We see those fused together. I think a lot of Chinese people separate politics and business in very, very different terms and have a very different language than we do. And I think that is really one of the major sources of confusion when East and West interact with one another on the issue of politics versus economics. So two key kind of takeaways there. But again, I think he represents, I've had countless conversations with Chinese people which mirror exactly what he said.
So to press you a little bit on that point, how do you see the split being different between politics and business in China and in, say, the US?
Well, again, he framed it as politics being, we're not going to send troops into Eastern Europe. That is a very crude definition of politics. And one of the things that you constantly hear from Chinese when you push them on this issue is they're saying, well, we haven't colonized other countries the way the West has. And they're kind of interpreting politics and the role of the state in militaristic terms. When we hear from people like John Bolton, and we hear from the U.S. State Department and even Christine Lagarde at the IMF, who are all talking about the political risks associated with debt and the implications on a country's sovereignty, that's a level of subtlety that is not being captured in the Chinese debate. The Chinese debate puts it in raw power politics terms, not in the kind of erosion of sovereignty that will eventually come because of too much debt. So again, the definitions are very, very different, and we're not having enough conversations like what we had with Zheng, where we're trying to understand how the other sees the world, because the Chinese worldview is very much like what we heard here, but I think a lot of people are going to walk away from this conversation unsatisfied.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, but at the same time, I feel like I also want to press the Western way of thinking on this into more specifics, because there has to be a way of speaking about the BRI without it only being about debt, right? Because the BRI, sure, debt is a very big part of the BRI, but debt is, to a certain extent, functions as a tool. All of this infrastructure needs to be built. The fact that these countries are so disconnected is a result of a lack of infrastructure, and so that infrastructure is needed, and debt then provides a way of doing that. But the BRI goes beyond debt. It looks at a different way of thinking about the world and a different way of thinking about how trade works. And so there's a refusal to engage with that part of the BRI, kind of with the kind of longer term vision of what all of this trade and interconnectedness will actually produce, that I find very frustrating in the Western kind of discourse around it. Because there is this kind of refusal to even talk about what an alternative trade architecture could even look like, as if it's some kind of end of history situation where we've already reached some kind of perfect trade dispensation and now we should just maintain it. When so much of the world is still excluded from these economies. So for that, I frequently find the Western discourse just frustrating.
No. I don't think I agree with you there, because the Americans in particular, and Donald Trump specifically, has a vision on trade. He doesn't believe in things like the World Trade Organization. He doesn't believe in these big multilateral trade groups like the WTO. He believes in bilateral arrangements, and he wants to go one-to-one with each country. That's his vision. I mean, we may not agree with it, but that's his vision, and that is an alternative vision to what the Chinese are doing with big multilateral forums like AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, like the Belton Road, which had dozens of leaders in Beijing recently. So it is a contrarian view on it, but it is a vision that is out there nonetheless. And I think that's important to kind of, put up there as a challenge to what the Chinese are trying to do. Three things I want to kind of quickly point people to in terms of some suggested reading, because I think if we want to understand, again, the Chinese mindset on this, there's some insights that we can get from Howard French's latest book, Everything Under the Heavens. And again, he talks about Tianxia and this idea that China stands at the center of the global economy. And this is how China ruled Asia for a very, very long time, by using asymmetric power, disproportionate economic power, to be able to set the agenda. And there are probably some of those historical instincts that are coming to play in some of this debt diplomacy as well. I also think to read Deborah Brautigim's first book. What was the first book? I'm forgetting it.
Dragon's Gift.
The Dragon's Gift. And she really talks about China's own development history in the 1970s. And that is very, very interesting, because I think it's instructive on how the Chinese are now engaging other developing countries, where they collateralized oil and coal to sell to Japan in exchange for infrastructure. Does that sound familiar? That's what the Chinese did back in the 1970s. So nothing about what the Chinese are doing today along the Belton Road is actually unique. So they're drawing on their own history there. And then the other part of it is the fact that, and we're going to have an interview coming up very, very shortly, talking about the chaos within the Chinese system. And you've mentioned this on many occasions, Cobus, that never assign conspiracy when mediocrity will do just fine. And in the case of the Chinese political and economic system, a lot of people think it's far more centrally controlled and organized than it actually is. Long time ago, you and I interviewed Johanna Malm, who was an expert in Sino-DRC relations in the Congo. And one of the things that she said way back in the day, this is almost 10 years ago, was how Chinese companies acting in the DRC were competing against each other, were not coordinating. They were not going back to Beijing for instructions or guidance and whatnot, and they were brutally going after one another. So there's a lot more chaos in the Chinese system than I think outsiders give it credit for. So those 3 points and those 3 insights into the Chinese thinking and really going back into history are very, very instructive into how the Chinese may be seeing Belt and Road. This, of course, on my part, is projection, but it's something that I think those are good insights and things that people might want to follow up and read. Final comments from you before we go, Cobus.
I completely agree with you that that it's really important to keep these aspects in mind. I think that it also then raises the question of to which extent the Chinese system really is fundamentally different and to which extent it looks different. Because as you mentioned, that obviously the fact that they are state-owned companies is very different from many Western systems. However, that doesn't exclude competition. The competition between major companies for contracts, that still is a key part of the way that this Chinese rollout and kind of outward movement is taking place. So I think it might be useful for this debate as it goes on for people to also try and avoid kind of exoticizing the Chinese system, as it frequently is done, to look at it as some kind of alien, entity that works completely fundamentally different from other economic systems. It's a very basic point, but I think to look for overlap is frequently more useful.
That may be the case, but we've never really seen something like the Chinese system, and I may be out of my depth here historically. But I don't know if there's ever been a hybrid authoritarian capitalist government like the Chinese who have had as much power that they have as today. This is a country with the second largest economy, the second largest navy, I think the largest army, not necessarily the best army, but the largest one. They've got an enormous amount of power. And now they're fighting for really control of global communication standards in 5G, in artificial intelligence, in machine learning. And that is something that the West has really never confronted. The Soviets challenged the Americans just with raw power, nuclear weapons. But they never really challenged them as in the myriad of ways that China is today in terms of its status and its share of global trade and its share of the global economy as a whole. So I think in some ways fear is a big part of why the United States and Europe is responding, because we've never really seen a competitor like the Chinese with an authoritarian capitalist model.
Well, maybe, sure. I mean, the authoritarian capitalist model part, I can see what you mean. I mean, there are overlaps with some, early stages of other Asian powers. But in terms of this kind of complete overlap between military, economic, kind of communications, etc., other power, I think for that reason it's really important to look at everything from an African perspective, because Africa has faced, kind of powers like that before, and they called the West.
That's right. So. No, fair enough. That is indeed a fair point. So we'd love to hear what you think. Cobus and I have kind of veered off course a little bit into the depths of history, but it is interesting to try and interpret what does Belt and Road actually mean. It's a pickup of our conversation last week. We don't really have the answer. I won't pretend to have the answer. I really enjoyed all the feedback that we got from people from all over the world who gave us their interpretation and what their experiences are, and particularly trying to understand this through Chinese eyes, which is something that's very, very difficult to do because of the kind of opacity that exists in how the Chinese communicate with the outside world on Belt and Road and other issues. So let us know what you think. You can reach us by email, eric@chinaafricaproject.com, or Cobus at ChinaAfricaProject.com. We love getting your email. I'm responding within 24 or 48 hours, almost on every email. They're coming in fast and furious, but I love hearing from you, so please do send me a message. You can also find me on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, all the different places, Cobus as well. We're there, and we'd love to engage with you on this discussion and pretty much anything else that we've done in our previous shows as well. It's always great to hear from you. So we'll be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. For Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus at Stadinsky or Eric at eOlander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.ChinaAfricaProject.com.